The screen flickered to life, casting a cold blue glow over the server room. Agent Miller tapped the glass, his finger tracing the silhouette of a man pacing a manicured garden on the monitor. The feed was grainy, struggling to resolve the figure against the stone terrace, but the identification was absolute. "We found him," Miller said, his voice barely cutting through the constant, low-frequency hum of the cooling fans. For 3 years, Eli Whitmore had existed only as a ghost in the financial system, a series of invisible numbers shifting across borders. Miller pulled up a secondary file. It displayed a complex web of offshore transfers, all terminating at an abandoned shipyard on the edge of London. Miller stared at the screen, watching the man in the garden stop and look toward the horizon. He was not just hiding, he was preparing. The team was already assembling in the hallway. He checked his watch, the second hand ticking in perfect sync with the server pulse. Dawn broke as a gray smear against the horizon, barely penetrating the thick fog clinging to the estate grounds. Miller signaled the team. They moved in silence, boots sinking into damp earth, weapons raised as they navigated the dense tree line. The perimeter fence yielded to a single, precise cut. They crossed the lawn, the stone terrace looming out of the mist like a tombstone. Miller reached the study door, hand hovering over the handle, breath hitching in the cold air. He kicked the door inward. It slammed against the inner wall with a violent crack. The team flooded the room, light beams cutting through the shadows, searching for a target who was already there. Whitmore sat behind his mahogany desk, motionless. He did not flinch at the intrusion. He did not look up. He simply closed his laptop with a soft, final click and slid a single encrypted drive across the polished wood surface. "You are late," Whitmore said, his voice steady, his gaze fixed firmly on the wall behind Miller. The agents stood frozen, weapons still leveled. Miller stepped forward, his fingers closing around the cold metal of the encrypted drive. As he lifted it from the desk, the floor beneath his boots gave a sudden, sharp shudder. It was not an earthquake. It was a rhythmic, deep-seated pulse that traveled up through the soles of his feet. The mahogany desk rattled, pens dancing across its surface. Miller glanced at his team, but they were already scanning the perimeter, weapons raised toward the ceiling. The hum grew louder, a low-frequency drone that rattled the teeth and made the air feel thick with static. It was coming from deep within the foundation, a massive mechanical awakening that drowned out the sound of the wind outside. Whitmore stood up, his movements fluid and unhurried. He smoothed his sleeves, his face a mask of absolute indifference. The shelves against the wall groaned, books sliding and falling as the vibration intensified. The trap had finally snapped shut. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, then bled into a harsh, pulsing crimson. Outside, the heavy estate gate slammed shut with a series of metallic thuds that echoed through the floorboards, sealing every exit. Miller spun toward the wall, his breath catching in his throat. The monitors, which had been dark, flared to life in unison. They no longer showed the garden or the perimeter. Instead, they displayed live, high-definition feeds of London, Manchester, and Birmingham. Traffic grids, power stations, and transit hubs flickered across the screens in a chaotic, synchronized dance. Whitmore stood perfectly still, watching the reflection of the red light dance in the glass of the monitors. He turned to face Miller, his expression devoid of any panic. "You think you found me?" he whispered, the words cutting through the mechanical drone. "But you have only walked into the final phase." The data on the drive in Miller's hand was not a confession. It was a trigger. The entire room seemed to lean into the silence. Whitmore turned his back on the team. He walked toward the heavy oak door with a steady, rhythmic stride. Miller raised his weapon, but his fingers stalled on the trigger. There was no target to engage, only a man walking away. Whitmore passed the armed agents, his shoulder brushing against them as if they were nothing more than furniture in his way. He reached the handle, pushed the door open, and stepped into the hallway. The heavy wood swung shut behind him with a final, echoing click. The lock engaged. Miller lunged for the door, slamming his shoulder against the frame, but it held firm. The vibration in the room continued, a low-frequency hum that rattled the very foundation. The hunt had been a success, But the drive in Miller's hand was not a trophy. It was a countdown. The game had only just begun.